So welcome back. My name again is Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown, and we're co-sponsors of this conference along with the Office of the President. And on behalf of my colleague John Borelli and collaborator, I want to welcome you to this third panel where we're going to be looking at the issue of human dignity in contemporary world affairs. And those of you who've been here throughout the day will recognize, I think, some continuities. We really began this morning with more of a historical overview of the origins of the document, some of the church politics, some of the international politics to which it gave rise. That was our first panel, and then you just heard, those of you who were with us, a wonderful keynote by Father Brian Hare on Pacem and Terris and its impact on Catholic social teaching and world politics more generally. And it was the second part of that talk which really links back to our discussion this afternoon. And here I think the starting point is, to what degree does all this talk about human dignity and peace and justice that was so well articulated back in 1963, some 50 years ago, to what extent does it matter in world politics? Does it play out in any meaningful way? Is it now, as it was then, and it has always been perhaps a form of discourse or rhetoric, just a cover for power politics that we're so familiar with, competition for economic, military, and political advantage in world affairs? Or is there something new afoot, and by new I mean since World War II, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with documents like Pacem and Terris, with the evolution of Catholic social teaching, with interfaith dialogue, which was touched on before, around these great questions of human dignity and human rights. That's sort of the framing question that we'll be looking at today with colleagues who follow contemporary world affairs, have been engaged in different ways in contemporary world affairs, who do not all come out of the Catholic tradition. So part of the purpose of this panel is also to open things up even more, very much in the spirit, I think, of Pacem and Terris, into a dialogue that cuts across the religious and the secular, and also the religious, the political, and the international. So what I thought I'd do is just introduce our panelists right now, and then ask you to welcome them, and then we'll just go down the line, and each of the colleagues here will present 10 to 15 minutes of reflections on this wider theme. I may have a couple of follow-up questions, and then we'll open it up to you. We should have ample time for a wider conversation. So directly to my right is Drew Christensen of the Society of Jesus, known to many of you as the editor of America, the Jesuit Weekly. He also is the former director of the Office of International Justice and Peace at the United States Catholic Conference, and has written widely on issues of human rights, international affairs, war and peace, Catholic social teaching. For those of you who don't know, I'm delighted to share the fact that Drew will be joining our faculty, our School of Foreign Service, this coming January. And I want to make sure I get your distinguished title correct here. Distinguished Professor, it says, of Ethics and Global Development. And so we're delighted to have you officially as part of our Georgetown community going forward. Next to Drew is my old colleague and friend, Tony Arendt. We've been together in the government department, the School of Foreign Service, for some 20 years. That's 20 years minus a couple for me and 20 years plus for Tony. He is an expert on international law, international institutions, issues of global governance, and has published widely in those areas. He also is the founder of our Institute for International Law and Politics, along with our dear colleague Chris Joyner. That institute was founded back in 2003, and since then, as many of you know, since 2008 in particular, Tony has taken on the task of managing, of running our Master of Science in Foreign Service, MSFS program, and has done wonderful things with that program, and in his own work has really addressed the issue of human rights. There's a current project that he and Mark Lagon are working with, looking at this intersection of human rights, human dignity, and international institutions that I'm sure he'll share with us. And then next to Tony is Paula Dobriansky, who is a leading diplomatic authority, public intellectual. She also has a link to Georgetown. She graduated from the School of Foreign Service. She served as Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs from 2001 to 2009. She was also Special Coordinator for Tibetan issues for the United States and the President's Special Envoy to Northern Ireland with the rank of Ambassador. Now Paula is working up in Cambridge as a Senior Fellow at Harvard at the JFK School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and she also serves as Chair of the National Board of the World Affairs Councils of America. So please join me in welcoming our panel. Yeah. Drew, why don't you get us started?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll begin with things that you've already heard, but move on, I think, to apply them in somewhat different ways to problems that face us for the immediate future. Pope John XXIII changed not only the substance of Catholic social teaching, moving from a duty-based natural law system to one based on human dignity and human rights. He also set the path toward a new, historically conscious way of doing moral teaching. Modern Catholic social teaching had always responded to changing social and political conditions. In Rerum Novarum, Leo XIII had responded to the situation of workers in the late Industrial Revolution. In Quadragesimo Anno, Pius XI had addressed issues of political economy in the age of the dictators, of Nazism, communism, and corporatism. But the papal teaching was always in the language of scholastic philosophy, with an explicit understanding that the teaching applied timeless principles to changing circumstances. In Pacem and Terris, John employed that older method, but as an historian and a diplomat, he brought to it a new sensibility for the novelty of history, what he famously called the signs of the times. The new sensibility pervades the whole encyclical, but it is most evident in three summaries of contemporary trends that conclude major parts of the encyclical, and we've heard about them today. The first two are entitled Characteristics of the Present Day. The eponymous passage is called The Signs of the Times. Each summarized the moral aspirations of the day. The first summary gathered together the aspiration for equality on part of several groups: workers, women, newly independent states, and minorities. The second focuses on the political conditions needed to support human dignity: bills of rights, written constitutions, the rule of law. The last, The Signs of the Times, focuses on international relations, the need to commit to resolve disputes through negotiation, the recognition of the irrationality of nuclear war, and the need for a culture of respect, not fear, in the relations of nations. The Second Vatican Council followed John's lead and made reading the Signs of the Times a duty of the whole Church. Conciliar and post-conciliar teaching utilized readings of the Signs of the Times in doing its teaching. Even with their restorationist inclinations, plus Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict, although they sometimes appeared to relegate Signs of the Times to a secondary role, nonetheless employed the method extensively. John Paul, notably in Solicitudo Rei Socialis, on social concern, and Benedict most recently in Caritas and Veritate, love in truth. When we consider the legacy of Pacem and Terris for the world affairs today, I think it behooves us to scrutinize the signs of our times with respect to international affairs. I would note only two aspects of the method that we should bear in mind. The first is a definition of the method by Cardinal Maurice Roy, the first president of the Pontifical Commission, Justice and Peace, as reading contemporary history through the sufferings and aspirations of people by light of the gospel. The Second Vatican Council was famous for identifying with the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the people of this day, especially those who are poor and in any way afflicted. Among the sufferings I think we ought to consider are frustrated aspirations, identified by Pope John Paul II and Centesimus Annus as one of the causes of war. John Paul was always careful in his own teaching to balance positive and negative signs of the times. And he caught a lot of criticism by neoconservatives after the publication of Solicitudo for the alleged moral equivalence of his balanced critique of capitalism and state socialism, as well as of the Western and Eastern blocs in the Cold War. Sometimes, as in the case of the desire for equality, we are dealing with aspirations born of suffering. So frustration is an important consideration in assessing the signs of the times. Shortly, I would like to point up the frustration over participation in global institutions as one issue to which we will need to attend. The second preliminary note is to say that the signs of the times is always a way of thinking about social morality in process. It doesn't look in the first instance for compliance with pre-existing norms, though those norms may shape our reading of the situation, but rather for paths to solution to societal, even global problems. As Paul VI wrote, the aim is to direct the options and commitments, to discern the options and commitments which are called for in order to bring about the social, political, and economic changes seen in many cases to be urgently needed. So the purpose is together to make history, often in new ways that contribute to building up what in biblical language is called the kingdom of God. The Signs of the Times method is intended to help communities of moral discernment to decide on how to act together to infuse our world with the gospel spirit. Now, on the whole, human rights takes the world in that direction, making human beings a kingdom of ends, as Kant put it. But rights as we experience them are also products of history. Only last week, for example, a judge in New York declared that underage women have a right to Plan B contraceptives. In another case, President Obama has appointed a committee to determine whether long waiting lines constitutes a violation of the right to vote. Of course, we are inclined to overlook the historical evolution of our rights in cases like the ones I just cited. We tend to regard human rights as absolutes, and for good reason. That is because any suggestion that makes rights contingent on other conditions tends to erode their protective capacity. Once established, rights are guarantees. They may not be denied. Others are obligated to honor them. Governments must enforce them. Today, we find ourselves in a world where rights are contested and are more and more in conflict with one another, except where muddied interests tilt the contest in one direction. One analysis of the Reformation claimed it resulted from an overgrowth of conflicting rights between church and state, king and nobles, free cities and universities, guilds and confraternities, monks and secular clergy. We can see the same kind of conflict today, for example, between states and unions over unionization of public service workers. Cash-poor states, municipalities, can afford to meet their contractual obligations with unionized workers. Workers can't afford to be without retirement and health care benefits. Win-win solutions are necessary. Yet in our basically adversarial American legal culture, getting to yes can be hard to do, even though others, like the Germans, have found ways to do so. Adjustments have to be made so that rights are realized for everyone, though no one is likely to have their rights realized to a maximal degree. My Jesuit colleague, David Hollenbach, has pointed out in Catholic social teaching, unlike American jurisprudence, rights can be adjusted. Rights can be adjusted to one another. They can be adjusted to the claims of different groups of people for the same right. That is why, for example, Pope Paul VI could call on people to sacrifice some advanced degree of enjoyment of their rights to the interests of others who possess less than a minimum. Hollenbach argues that we may distinguish the core rights that constitute the basic requirements of human dignity from instrumental rights that establish legal entitlements. So, for example, the right to life, a basic right, may not grant a legal entitlement to a kidney transplant, though, with adequate resources, it should guarantee basic health care. Or, in a classic example from the 1960s, the right to private property may not provide an entitlement to extensive land holdings to the detriment of the livelihood of landless peasants. Americans bolt at such an idea, but Locke understood it, granting a proviso for the sake of the common good. Locke's proviso has been explained away as applying only to the transition from barter economy to the cash economy, so it didn't apply to later times. For Catholicism, however, it is an ongoing principle. The exercise of rights in Catholic teaching, in any case, can be restricted in the interest of equal basic level of enjoyment of that right by others. I would argue that as we move ahead in the world where the globalization of capital moves much faster than the globalization of labor, exacerbating inequality, and where the accelerated pace of technological change is ceaselessly altering our expectations about work, we are less and less able to make unencumbered absolute claims to the enjoyment of particular instrumental rights as we have in the past. We will have to make quick adjustments on our expectations of what we can expect as a right. And so, right now, as we gather here, people in the White House and the Congress are debating about adjustments in the social contract on Social Security and Medicare. It often appears that the Madisonian mechanism of divided decision-making inhibits the defense of human dignity in our fast-moving world. Amending the Constitution may also be ill-suited to the current protean social environment. I would argue that it is at this point that the Signs of the Times method can assist us in making adequate adjustments of rights in a way that responds to our evolving sense of demands of human dignity. It can provide a way of approaching in common the changes society is undergoing, and together explore what new institutions we need to protect the dignity of men and women in those evolving and evolved circumstances. The Signs of the Times doesn't yield political decisions, but it can yield a consensus across groups who are committed to civic action and so provide an impetus to new political settlements. Let me move to the particular I want to talk about. As I've reflected on the legacy of Pacem and Terris these last months, it strikes me that one sign of the times is the need for new ways to embody the right to participate in public life. A generation ago, political scientists realized that by itself, the right to vote did not make for democracy. As Tocqueville understood, democracy grows out of civic institutions, those intermediary associations that we talked about earlier. But from the PTA to labor unions to churches, our civic institutions are either in decline or under stress. At the same time, we see the frustration everywhere at the public's inability to affect the institutions that rule our lives. We need to invent new ways to participate in institutions that shape our lives. Last week, Professor Thomas Poga of Yale gave a lecture at Boston College entitled, "Are We Stealing the Rights of the Poor?" He argued that large-scale, often global institutions deprive ordinary people of participation in decisions that greatly affect their lives. One example Professor Poga used was the World Trade Organization. He claimed that superorganizations like the World Trade Organization have had their regulatory power captured by narrow elites. Poga's articulation of the elite capture of global institutions recalled for me my time as a member of the Holy See delegation to the 1999 World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle. Known as the Battle of Seattle because protesters blocked delegates' entrance to the conference for a couple of days, the 1999 WTO meeting failed, first because of the opposition by member states to the participation by non-governmental organizations in their general assemblies, and secondly, due to the suppression of participation of developing countries by the host country, the U.S. Yep, just a couple more. The WTO Secretariat had opened the General Assembly to NGOs, but the member states, with some reason, objected that no one had elected the NGOs to make their cause part of the agenda. On the other hand, many governments were not popularly elected. Further, few governments, though freely elected, adequately represented the interests of the poor and other affected parties in their countries. At the same time, under the guidance of the U.S. Trade Representative, many of the working committees were never called to order, and others simply convened rump sessions of the leading industrial or agricultural exporting countries, excluding delegates from the less developed countries. The failure in Seattle was a failure of participation. There was a double capture of Seattle, as Professor Fogel put it, as an exclusion of NGOs and an exclusion of the Global South. While I don't have time here to make a full case, the devising of better modes of public participation in global decision-making conforms with Pope John's belief that a globalized world requires improved systems of global governance, a point at which Benedict XVI and the Pontifical Council of Justice and Peace have also insisted, and reference been made to their declarations today. The ordinary human, I concede, has a limit on how much active participation he or she can involve themselves in. As Oscar Wilde once quipped, there are not enough nights in the week to be a good socialist. Still, I believe one major challenge for human dignity in the coming decades will be how to structure our institutions including supranational ones like the WTO and the UN, so as to retain space for expression of personal human agency and the agency of large groups of people. The essence of human dignity, as Pope John Paul II explained in the Bar Magzurchens. With the digital revolution moving at lightning speed, most people have more free time. The challenge would be to see the new free time can be transformed from inconsequential interaction across the social media to genuine participation in institutions that make a meaningful difference in the lives of all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One thing I found fascinating about looking at Pacem and Terris again is as I looked at it as a graduate student, I had a particular perspective on it, and that was about 30 years ago. So as we look back on it now, 50 years after its promulgation, the more I see how applicable it is to what I'm going to call the present age, and indeed the signs of the time that we see today. And I'm going to touch on three themes, and these are all, not surprisingly, things which Brian talked about in his keynote address. One of them is the concept of human dignity itself, so the concept of human dignity. The second is, if you will, the role and responsibility of the state. And the third is the inadequacy of the international system, all of which are discussed in the document, all of which I think are critical for us understanding the international system and the world and the way forward today. Now, the first is the idea of human dignity. And I think as you read the document the first time, human dignity and human rights sort of flow together, and you really miss, in my view, the power of the concept of human dignity. And that's something that I think is extraordinarily important and applicable today. By human dignity, we mean the respect, and John the 23rd meant the respect of the personhood, the full personhood of the individual, and the responsibility for civil authorities to allow that personhood to thrive, to flourish, to succeed. Now, in using the term human dignity, there is a sense in which John the 23rd swept aside so many of the debates that were surrounding the human rights community at the time. Because think of it. In 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was promulgated, and I've heard the same story about Jacques Maritain, essentially saying we couldn't agree on the bases of these things, so let's just promulgate some rights. If you look at the debates that took place in the United Nations General Assembly and in the Human Rights Commission, which of course Eleanor Roosevelt chaired, you see this huge disparity between economic and social rights, between political and civil rights, with the Soviet Union at its time and the allies, their allies saying economic and social rights are more important than civil and political rights, and of course the West saying no, 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 no. Well, there's a sense in which the concept of human dignity sets aside that sterile debate and says this: if we're going to affirm the personhood of every individual, they need certain fundamental civil and political rights, as we would call them, but they also need some basic economic and social rights. We get into this sterile debate, and the international community and the United Nations, unfortunately, has reiterated that debate, and it prevents us from seeing what we need to do to affirm the personhood of the individual. That's why I think today the concept of human dignity can play an important role in the international political arena with states, representatives of states, international officials, starting with the concept of human dignity and trying to move beyond these sterile debates and the human rights arguments that have been taking place. There's also another sense in which human dignity is more powerful than human rights, and that is that many people, many scholars and others would say that we're in a post-rights discourse period. Now, what do they mean by that? Well, there are different phases as human rights have developed, and at some point, whether it's women's rights or rights of minority groups or gay rights, each time there's a claim that we need to recognize the equality of these various groups, and that's correct. But at the end of the day, people actually are different. Women are different from men. I cannot bear children. Women can bear children. That means human dignity, while according a basic level of equality, also means according the respect due to difference. The respect due to difference. And I think this transcends the whole traditional debate on human rights from a legal perspective. So that's one huge contribution I see in the encyclical. A second area is, and I mentioned the role and responsibility of the state. Brian illustrated extremely well how this very much reflects traditional natural law thinking. Individuals have certain rights. Individuals group together as a state. The state has certain rights. It affirms the doctrine of sovereignty. States have a right to interact in a particular way in the international system. There is an equality of states that exists in the international system. But it doesn't stop there. Now, much international relations theory, at least the sort of the traditional realist view, did stop there. What the document does, what the encyclical actually does, is affirm something which the United Nations has only recently come around to discovering, and that is the responsibility to protect. So if you look at the document, and I find this remarkable, this is at paragraph 98. It says, "We must remember that, of its very nature, civil authority exists, not to confine its people within the boundaries of their nation, but rather to protect, above all else, the common good of that particular civil society." This means that the state needs to be conceptualized not just as something that enjoys sovereign rights vis-a-vis other states, but that has a responsibility to protect its people. And the encyclical goes on to say, and a responsibility to promote the common human good, the common good of the entire international system. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is as the UN discovers this doctrine or rediscovers this doctrine, this is also a powerful tool for diplomats and public officials where you say to a state, yes, we acknowledge that you're sovereign, but that means you have this responsibility to act to protect your individuals. So very important affirmation. Final point I'll note is the document, the encyclical refers to the inadequacies of the international system. And this is at paragraph 135. "Under the present circumstances of human society, both the structure and form of governments, as well as the power which public authority wields in all the nations of the world, must be considered inadequate to promote the universal common good." Now, my view is that's a truism. It was a truism in 1963, and it's a truism in 2013. But then the question is, what does it mean? As Brian and others have pointed out, there's obviously then a movement toward more international authorities, international governance. And so the encyclical mentions the United Nations. It mentions the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and a variety of other things. But Mr. Kincaid raised the question about, well, does this mean that there should be a world government? As you read the document, you might say, well, gee, that is what it's suggesting or what it could lead to. I would argue it isn't. What it is saying is that there needs to be more international authorities to deal with the kinds of issues that cannot adequately be dealt with by states. Principle of subsidiarity would say if a state can deal with something, then the state should deal with something. But if there are issues that transcend state boundaries, the only way to deal with them is through some kind of international arrangement. Now, maybe it's a regional arrangement in the traditional sense. Maybe it's an organization dealing with a particular issue, like the World Trade Organization or the World Health Organization or some other entity. But what I'm going to suggest is that statespeople, government officials, need to think a little more creatively here about the kinds of international institutions that may serve this purpose. And what I'm talking about, and this is something Tom mentioned, the book that Ambassador Lagon and I are doing on human dignity and the future of global institutions. One thing we attempt to do in this book is look at these new innovative institutions, hybrid institutions, public-private partnerships, global funds. An example would be, for instance, the Global Fund for HIV/AIDS that was created when Paula was in office. These kinds of ideas to deal with broader international issues. It's not a world government. It's not simply an organization comprised of a variety of states at the regional level, but it's these hybrid institutions which can play the role of providing some kind of international authority to deal with these issues that transcend state boundaries. So, as I look at the document, it speaks to us today. The concept of human dignity, better understanding the role of the state as having a responsibility to protect its citizens and promote the global common good, and understanding that the state system is still inadequate ultimately to address all these problems and challenges in the international system. And so the onus is then on us to take that, to think creatively about new directions for international and global governance.
Thank you. All right.
Congratulations are in order to Georgetown University for holding this very unique forum on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Pacem and Terris. And I think you heard a very clear and very compelling articulation by Tony that the very theme of human dignity and world affairs does have both contemporary relevance as well as historical relevance. What is significant is that the concept that was formulated in 1963, it's very striking that at the height of the Cold War, think about it, the Cuban Missile Crisis during that time, it's still very relevant today. We do live in a very different world, one that in some ways you can argue is more complex. Father Hare had described the period of the Cold War, the tense and very dangerous situation with nuclear missiles. Fast forward today, the concern about nuclear proliferation, but the added concern that it isn't a bipolar kind of confrontation, it is much more diverse and diffuse. So in this sense, what is remarkable is this very concept and its elements are very, very relevant for today. What have we learned? I would say that particularly with regard to human rights, first, the fact that foreign policy cannot just be based primarily and predominantly on power relationships, that it has to be based on the very recognition and the importance of human dignity as embodied in human rights, and the human dignity not just of one, two, or a nation, but of all human beings. That also presumes the importance predicated on preservation, protection of human dignity, that it has to be rooted in the fundamental protection of human rights. And I think that here again, I think that Tony, in a very compelling and very, very vigorous way, made that linkage of how it is embodied and how it is further than the original, if you will, articulation of human rights. I'd also add that foreign policy is not exclusively, by the way, driven by human rights. What it is human rights is integral. It has always been integral to American foreign policy, but it is not always the sole driving force and factor of our policy. When you look at it, I think it could be argued that there's always a balance of what one considers idealism and realism, but that comes in different percentages, depending on the case and the circumstance. But what one can say confidently is that these two elements are always there and are always part of it. Foreign policy is also driven substantially by the promotion of those conditions where human beings can flourish. We've heard the importance of democracy, good governance, rule of law, tolerance, and so forth. All of these elements are absolutely essential. But also at the same time, I think we all realize that there isn't a perfect scenario. The idealistic portrayal of the human condition is not 100% attainable, but it is a good guide for action. And that's the essence of Pacem in Terris. And I think also very importantly, it has provided a vision of how society ought to be organized. It was relevant then, it's very relevant now. Let me mention three specific examples, some that were already alluded to, where these concepts can essentially, they undergird very practical actions in foreign policy. The first being the concept of responsibility to protect. What's striking to me is not only was it articulated in Pacem in Terris, but at the same time, it also had not been developed initially. We can say that now this is a topic and an issue that I believe is front and center in American foreign policy. The graphic case in point in recent time is the coalition that was organized to deal with what was taking place in Libya. As you may recall, Gaddafi stated rather unequivocally that he would go door to door and he would murder anyone who was in opposition to his regime. Toward this end, the United States, along with others, came together and under the concept of responsibility to protect, the morality of ensuring that those individuals who expressed differing viewpoints, that their lives would be sustained, we came together to take action. This was responsibility to protect. But let me add, because looking forward, although this concept is out there, it's a difficult one. I gave you a positive example where it worked. Let me give you a current example where it hasn't actually worked. And that is the case of Syria. That's uppermost in my mind, with some 80,000 people, and maybe even more by the day, who have lost their lives. There has been an attempt by some to try to put this kind of coalition in supporting responsibility to protect the very lives of these individuals, but it hasn't quite happened. Secondly, I want to highlight the example of women, because that is an area which I think, in the context of foreign policy and its actual implementation, has become much more relevant and germane. I was very struck by the language, in fact, in the encyclical, and where it stated specifically about the rights of women to work. Do you know that the United Nations, maybe it's been about 15 years, maybe even a little bit more years ago, came together and sponsored what is known as the Arab Human Development Report. I picked this out because it was striking to me. This was a report that was written by Arabs, Arab scholars, academics, others, who came together to talk about why the Middle East is not growing, why its development has been stunted. It was striking to me that one of the areas cited was the fact that women were not given their fullest opportunities to grow and to be able to develop their full potential and to contribute that potential to their communities and to their respective countries. So in this case, specifically, what you have are societies that basically are blocking half of its population by not giving them opportunities. Well, these concepts have become much more in the forefront of our policies, definitively, in recent time. And there are many examples that we could discuss. And right up to the previous Secretary of State, Secretary Clinton, who placed a real premium on this issue, and in each and every one of her trips abroad, this was always part of the agenda. The third and last example that I would like to give is one that Ambassador Mark Lagon, who used to head the Trafficking in Persons Office at the State Department, an area that is somewhat new. New in the sense that it was only in recent time when our foreign policy discourse felt it was important to look at really the heart of the human dignity here in this case, and it affects both young men, women, and that is those who are victims of being trafficked, where literally an individual's integrity and very being is violated. In this case, I would say the good news here is that, like the other two, this one is also become very much part of our discourse. So much so that now the State Department has an office in trafficking in persons, of which Ambassador Lagon was spearheading. But not only that, it has institutionalized action predicated on protection, prevention, and prosecution, and has made it global, where we engage other societies who have not placed a similar premium on not only just the well-being, but the protection of those individuals who have been subject to this most egregious crime. These are just 3 examples where I think that you can see that the encyclical has such relevance, not only then, but now. But I'd also add in conclusion that you can also see that still this is a work in progress. Each of these areas that I have mentioned are areas that must be continued to be supported, to be bolstered, and that we must make sure that it's not the exception, but it becomes the mainstay of what we do going forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think we have 3 interesting takes on the issue that are very complementary and can help to frame a wider discussion. Drew's going back a bit to the document itself, the Catholic context, and then exploring its relevance in domestic politics and some global issue areas. And then Tony focusing in on the conceptual question, why human dignity, and relating that to more familiar debates about human rights. And now Paula telling us about how this plays out across a range of contemporary issue areas. Maybe before I throw it open for a wider discussion, so start thinking of questions, I'm puzzled by sort of the timing of all this. We have this 50th anniversary, so it's an occasion to reread this document and to see how it resonates with the current moment, and human dignity was really and has been a theme that does that. Could we have had this conversation about human dignity in world affairs 10 years ago or 15 years ago? Sure. But what has changed, and why has it changed? If you agree with the premise that the topic has become more salient, why is that? That would be, maybe each of you could reflect a little bit on that. Tony, do you want to get us going? Yeah.
So I'm inclined to think that in the midst of the Cold War, it was a very different kind of concept, because the international system was so divided, and if we were from the Soviet Union, we would say, oh, we're affirming human dignity. And if we were from the West, we would say we're affirming human dignity. So the end of the Cold War, I think, created a new dynamic in the international system. Now, it was a real period of international uncertainty. So from '89 into the early '90s, the international leaders, the United States especially, were trying to figure out what in the world was going on and how to come up with a plan. I think George Herbert Walker Bush made an attempt. The Clinton administration made an attempt as well. But then what hit squarely in the middle of that in 1994? Rwanda. A genocide taking place in 100 days. 800,000 people were slaughtered in 100 days. The most efficient genocide in history, and the international community did nothing. They did nothing. That coming in the midst of this uncertainty began to give both the Clinton administration and then the Bush administration thoughts about how to respond. And I think this sort of evolutionary progress with the end of the Cold War, the Rwandan genocide, we could put it in Somalia and the Balkans as well, and a commitment of the United States and others that something has to be done. And so, it's been a slow progress, but as time has gone by, I think, and then with the responsibility to protect, there's been more of a sense that we need to be thinking in this direction. So I would say sort of historically, we're at a time where these thoughts of human dignity are more fertile, and I apologize for a long-winded answer.
I would just add to that, not only, I think, the significance of Rwanda, as you mentioned, but also I think that one has witnessed in recent time reflections on past genocides and a kind of rethinking of why they happened, why a number of countries would not step forward, and why those historians did come forward and say, we need to reevaluate, we need to look. Why did this happen? How could it have happened? And then, as certainly highlighted by and pushed forward by Rwanda. But let me add a second element, and that is, it strikes me from being a practitioner, a significant change that I've witnessed is also actually what institutionally has changed. I was thinking, as Tony was speaking, the fact that We didn't even have, and certainly in 1963, there was no Human Rights Bureau at the State Department. It came later in the Carter administration, and Pat Darien was the first Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. So that kind of institutionalization and having literally a body that can ensure that there is vigilance in fighting for an agenda and these issues is also very critical. Because think about it, even with the outset and the establishment of the Human Rights Bureau, more issues came forward. The issue, in fact, I mentioned it, of trafficking in persons. That came about in recent time. At the end of the Clinton administration, it was our Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, that came forward and demanded the State Department to establish such an office, saying you must take action. And by the way, the reason for it was because the United States is not a source country, but we are very much affected and have to be affected by what's happening in the world around us. It is globalized. And in this case, there are those victims who would come to the United States and then this kind of criminal activity is occurring on our own very shores. So I would add to what Tony said, the fact that we've had also a debate, a discussion by these very events, and a call for institutional actions in our bureaucratic architecture that would take responsibility for not only embracing these issues, but ensuring that they are front and center in our policies, or at least debated.
I would underscore the globalization question. I think as time has evolved, more and more nations have become integrated, or are becoming integrated. So you think of Myanmar, that was secluded for 50 years, now coming into the world. And so its own ethnic problems, its own interreligious problems, are now becoming public, and there's occasion for a response and interaction there. The Arab Spring would be another example where the globalization is having an effect, where an area that was stable and backward is now kind of dealing with the issues of modernization in a way it hadn't before, and rights get contested. I think the second is the great growth that I don't think John could have anticipated of intermediary associations dealing with these issues in the last 50 years, and especially since the conflict in the Balkans. I think not only do you have these intermediate associations, but you have the growth of cottage industries, a group of people doing forgiveness, doing reconciliation, doing prevention and peace building after conflicts, and all they have seen the importance of human dignity in being able to build the structures that sustain peace. So I think all that plays into it as well.
I'd maybe add just one related element on the topic of globalization, and I suppose this is more speculative, but the integration, the growth of global communications technologies, the intensification of the connections, the ability to experience, if not firsthand, at least at a distance, the suffering of people around the world, that over time, perhaps that's creating a sense of global humanity and solidarity, a shared sense of human dignity that was not there to the extent that it is now. That's admittedly a more hopeful and speculative notion, but perhaps that's part of it as well.
Yeah. I'll just give a graphic example of that, something that struck me greatly, and that is in the case with Afghanistan. When there was the operation that occurred in Afghanistan, executed by the United States with its coalition, many Americans in particular saw the young women in burqas. And what was striking to me was that there were so many Americans who had no connection to Afghanistan whatsoever, no relationship, but there was an outpouring of care and concern for these young girls and doing something good for them and about their welfare. That is the whole essence of their dignity.
Very good. All right, we've already got some hands up, a lot of hands. We'll see how many we can get through. Let's take these three questions here to begin with. Marilyn first, and Mark. Let's grab the mic. If you briefly introduce yourself and pose a question.
Marilyn McMarr, Georgetown University. I would also include the AIDS crisis. I would also include the work of the niche countries like Canada and Norway, the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, things like Live Aid. I think our notions of dignity are affected by some of those movements.
Mark?
I'm Mark Lagon with the Masters of Foreign Service program. Paul, I wondered if you might comment on something that Professor Aaron said. He was talking about how human dignity sort of fuses political rights and economic rights in a holistic sense. And a couple of the examples you raised, human trafficking, which we worked on, and I guess you know, issues of women are examples of that. But are there some others that, what do you think of this idea? Are there limits to what Professor Aaron is saying about how political rights and economic prosperity are fused? Or, you know, if you think of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, or, you know, getting access for antiretroviral drugs for those who had HIV/AIDS, do you think one has to have a kind of holistic view of the political and the economic?
Oh, sorry.
There's so many hands who want to collect. Yeah.
Excuse me. Richard Stevens. Actually, I was student here in the 50s, adjunct professor in the late 80s. Very active in the field, and I am here today representing a group called the Association for the Sustainable Development of the Rio Tambo, Peru, commissioned by the first indigenous Ashaninka, the largest tribe in Peru, to represent them, hopefully, in the United States. My question is actually a question and statement, pointing out our problem.
Question, please. This is not a time to set out the wider issue.
The question is, we have the problem of representing a people vis-a-vis government. We also have the internal problem, the people. Women. A major problem that we have is trying to address domestically, internationally, the fact without contraceptives, the girls in this area.
Sorry, is this an indigenous?
This is what I would like to know from those who are academically involved. How do we deal with this basic problem of young girls, and we're not able to deal with governments because we are cut off?
Very good. So a question about young women, the gender issue, and then Mark's question. Do you want to handle those? Yeah.
Well, let me go to Mark's issue. On Mark's issue, and relevant to your comment, when Tony said what he said, I liked very much what he said, because you gave examples of where it is fused together. But I can give examples where there is a debate and discussion in the foreign policy community about development. Do you go for economic rights first or political rights? I mean, the case in point here, people look at China right now, and many say, well, they have, you know, economic rights, and that's enough. You know, that's enough. My own view is, and because I did have the hat of being special coordinator for Tibet, you know, you see in a case like that where you have Tibetans who want the very right to practice their own religion, Tibetan Buddhism. They're thankful that the Chinese government has assisted them greatly economically in growing Lhasa, you know, helping them that way. But having said that, at the same time, here you have a denial of those basic rights. And His Holiness has stated this time and again. So as an example, I would say that I think that you have to have political rights. It's not just about economic rights. It's about the totality of the individual and how that individual wants to live. So you look at a Tibetan being deprived, you know, fine, there are some growth there, but that doesn't suffice for the freedom of the individual. And it's that freedom of the individual that I think undergirds the encyclical and plays out in today's world.
I think with respect to women, Marianne Cusimano-Love is our expert here, not only because she presented, because she's done some very good studies of the place of women in development and the work of Catholic women in development. So I'd recommend that you chat with Marianne afterwards. I'd say, but the holistic thing is very important here too. I think, you know, if you're talking about responsible reproduction, overall health and education are greatly important. And if you attend to contraception without education, healthcare, and jobs, you're missing the point, I think.
Let's gather 3 more questions. Maybe move over here. Mariana, and then here at the end, and then up here at front. Good. Yeah.
This question refers back to the holistic approach to political and civic rights with economic and social rights. In the case of Rwanda and its reconstruction post-genocide, many people criticize Kagame's government for oppressing the political rights of the people. But I wanted to ask you, what is more important, like peace and stability, and economic development to the point in which political freedom can be sustained with, I don't know, with the growth of the country, or should the government address both economic and political rights, risking a future genocide or a future civic conflict?
Right, Marianne, please pass the mic down to the end. There's a question right there. Yes, please.
A little bit of a different take, I guess. My question is, how do you get Pacem and Terris into the corporate boardroom? We have international organizations that affect the lives of workers in many different countries, and affects the environment of many different countries. These corporations are not governments, but they impact across governments and across countries. How do they get connected with Pacem and Terris?
Let's just take those 2 for now. Maybe could you take this issue of the intersection with business ethics and corporations? Is there a connection, do you think? Oh,
I think there's very definitely a connection. I think the UN is dealing with it in some of its covenants between business people on variety of ethical issues, transnational ethical issues. But I think in the church, the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace has been trying to reach out. It had a project that issued in a document last fall on the vocation of the business person, and it seems to me that they're trying to reach out. That there's an institute, particularly at the University of St. Thomas, that's propagating that material. I think here at Woodstock, there's been the Woodstock Business Project that tries to educate business people about Catholic social teaching, but it's the real outreach has to be in the pulpits. And as Cardinal Turkson said at the conference at Catholic University this week, the big problem is the clergy themselves have not received Catholic social teaching, and therefore they're afraid to preach about it. I mean, clergy of all denominations are afraid about conflict in their congregations, so they're afraid to talk about social ethical issues because it'll raise underlying differences in the community. But ways have to be found for them not only to learn the material but also to teach. I mean, in the National Religious Partnership of the Environment, which involved Catholics, mainline Protestants, Jews, and evangelicals, we twice tried to have a part of the thing, an education program on consumerism. Consumerism, we felt, those who were kind of on the operational level, was the major issue which Americans had to deal responsibly with the environment. And twice it fell apart, you know. And in the first instance, at least, it was because 2 of the member religious groups fell apart even at their decision-making levels about being able to raise that issue in their congregations. So you have to deal with the ability of clergy members to face conflict in people that they're serving, as well as the ability to responsibly handle the teaching and handing on of the doctrine.
Tony, could you speak to the...
Yeah, can I jump in on the corporate social responsibility issue? And I'm going to do something that a professor frequently does. Mark Lagon has actually been working extensively on this issue with the Business Human Rights Coalition, and recently gave a talk on how we can get businesses to be more engaged. Mark, would you be willing to maybe share a couple comments on the idea of corporate social responsibility and enlisting the private sector to deal with some of these issues?
The question is very apt. If we're going to talk about international institutions and responsible institutions, you need to look at corporations as well. I've just following on to work in government with Undersecretary Dobriansky on human trafficking. I've been involved in helping form a global business coalition against human trafficking. And I think it's important for businesses to not just have philanthropy, to give to civil society organizations and do good, but to look at their own business operations and their supply chains and see where they may be causing harm, to have a kind of Hippocratic oath. And so some of the companies, whether they be Ford or the Carlson Hotel Group or Delta Airlines, are trying to do that to combat both sex trafficking and forced labor.
By the way, I'll just add before you continue on, just a footnote, because on that particular question, the last footnote I'd make is the interesting thing is that from a governmental standpoint, there are so many public-private partnerships. And I think what Mark said is key, because it's not just the giving, but it is also the responsibility that goes with it. And there are many that have stepped forward, and whether it's HIV/AIDS and providing distribution networks, those that are engaged in trafficking in persons have really have provided some very, very on-the-ground assistance that has improved substantially people's lives.
Yeah.
One other function of the church that is overlooked frequently is that the church can be a convener on pressing social issues. So, for instance, in the Diocese of Humboldt-Thibodaux in southern Louisiana, the church brought together the local farmers, the local fishermen, with the oil companies that were depleting the groundwater and leading to subsidence, and therefore both the agriculture and the aquaculture were suffering. And the church, they all went to church. And so Catholic Charities could bring them all together to talk about the issues and finding common solutions together. And that's one advantage we don't think of at the church, that everybody's there together, and the church can serve as a convener as long as people aren't afraid to hear disagreement in a conversation. And it really, in many places, that's functioned well. It functioned well in the Northwest, the Northeast, I'm sorry, the old Northwest, and around the Great Lakes states on the issue of urban sprawl by an initiative of Bishop Pilla, who wrote about urban sprawl, and then all sorts of dioceses began to deal with the problems they had and got international awards for the work they did. But it was, again, a convening function.
Maybe just to close out this interesting discussion of the business or the economic dimension, one key intersection with human dignity is the question of economic inequality or social inequality, which is an embedded theme within the document. It's not something we talk a lot about in United States political culture. It's certainly a global concern. So it'll be interesting to see whether the dialogue with business is able to get at that question and all the problems it raises with our ideals of equality of opportunity in practice in this country, not to mention around the world. Tony, could you say something to Mariana's point, the important point about when you don't want to be pushing human dignity and human rights because state order is important, you sometimes have to work with autocrats in practice.
So there's always a tension. There's a tension between, in any given case, like Paula was talking about Tibet and how you approach that when you can say, well, certain economic rights are being guaranteed, but civil and political rights aren't. So there always is going to be a tension. And I would actually say one needs to approach it on a case-by-case basis. Informed by a desire to promote human dignity, the sequencing may vary from case to case. How you do it and the method may vary from case to case. I think that the teleology, what you're trying to do in promoting human dignity, always has to be in front of you and always has to be what your guiding goal is. I would also say, though, that it can sometimes be too easy to say, well, we've done X, we've promoted economic rights, therefore we don't have to worry about this, or we promoted civil rights, and therefore we don't have to worry about this. So with the ultimate goal of human dignity being in front of you, I think one can see how there will necessarily be a balancing. There's one other tension, and we think of promoting stability in societies, and when we look at places like Rwanda or El Salvador or South Africa, where you have sort of this tension between peace and justice, if I can throw those out in a very apologetic way, but with the notion that you may have people who've committed all kinds of atrocities, and then you have a need for the society to move on. Different societies have found different ways to deal with that. You have the Kachaka process, for example, in Rwanda. You've had Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. There is, in my view, no one-size-fits-all. You need to understand the people, you need to understand the culture, but I think if the ultimate goal of human dignity is in front of you, you'll be able to manage that. Again, that's not the best of answers. We need to look at the case, but I think you always need to be guided by that.
All right, one more round of questions before we close. We've got one here, and young woman here in the second row. Okay.
My name is Ken Teleska. I'm a pastoral counselor. I work for Catholic Charities, and I see human indignity, if you will, on a different level. People are coming for help because they're depressed or anxious. And what I see is a common denominator about a lot of the people that are coming from some help. Low self-esteem because there's a history of abuse in the family. And it doesn't have to be physical abuse. It's emotional abuse. It's the way they're treated or not treated or mistreated. And it's just amazing. You know, if it doesn't, if dignity is not there, it's not anywhere. No, I really had, you know, more of a comment. You're talking about human indignity on a wider level. Brings up an area for me to think about in terms of the work that I'm doing.
Just please pose a question because we're running really short on time.
Any advice you can give me in that area?
Thank you. I'd forgotten gentleman here, and then we'll move over here. Yeah.
My name is Ed Gaffney. I teach genocide and Shoah studies in a course on international law and the use of force. Hence, when I hear genocides referred to, and when I hear the assassination of 6 of my brothers in the Society of Jesus and their 2 house workers referred to as though they are opposite poles between justice and peace, I have to say that the Convention on Torture admits of none of these ways of balancing, whatever, under any circumstance. Every ride on every train to the killing centers was torturous. And hence, those are the easy ways of talking about the ways in which the last half hour has been filled with a kind of optimism that would have shocked Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Ramsey if they were here today at Georgetown. So the question is, how do we draw from documents like Gaudium et Spes and Pacem and Terris reflections that are clearly based on that idea of human dignity that all 3 of you spoke to, but are nowhere mentioned, such as torture, never found in either document, such as genocide, never found in either document. But a century of genocide, excuse me, it is not that the world community did nothing in 1994. The United States government, through its State Department, explicitly canceled the possibility of the level of subsidiarity that was appropriate to that, and it prohibited every ambassador and every member of its staff from using the G word. So at some point in the conversation today, we have to come back to that point made effectively by Brian about sin or whatever like that, the failure of ourselves. It's always a good place to begin.
Thank you. 2 more questions. Young woman here. Second row.
Fatima Bahja from the CCT program. I just had a quick question to Professor Arend regarding the, when you talked about having more international authorities to deal with issues that transcend state boundaries. And I can't help but wonder, how would you identify or deal with issues that transcend state boundaries without clashing with a state's sovereignty or infringing upon their role and responsibility as a state?
Okay, and final question from Eli over here.
Hi, Eli McCarthy. I teach Justice and Peace Studies here at Georgetown. My question is this: do we need more agreement on the basis of human dignity? And the reason why, I think Tony's point about this debate of whether political or economic rights really represent or express human dignity, it seems like in the West, particularly in the U.S., dignity is primarily based on a capacity to choose, and in the Russia or China, dignity is more based on perhaps social nature or being in community. Even in our own country, we hear statements from the Supreme Court saying, the use of the death penalty is a way to honor the dignity of the perpetrator. Or we hear statements from politicians saying it's based on human dignity to kill the enemy to prevent their own violence. And in the meantime, our last 2 popes have said that any kind of violence degrades the dignity of the victim and the perpetrator. So that's my question. Do we need more agreement on the basis of dignity? Because otherwise it seems like it's getting used in a whole bunch of different ways, and it's functioning primarily as preferences or national interest.
Well, we've got 3 questions and 3 panelists, and we're a little short on time. So let me ask Paula to speak to this big issue of, are we being too optimistic? Are we celebrating in advance of human dignity, a greater awareness of human dignity, and maybe overlooking some real issues that deserve attention?
The gentleman's
Yes.
point here.
Yeah.
I have to agree with the essence of what you said. I think that the reason why we're celebrating where we are today, as I said, is because who would have thought that a document like this in 1963 would not only have relevance today, but have advanced. But having said that, as at least I said, and I believe all of us said, we have a ways to go. Your specific point about torture and genocide, I have to say I agree. I didn't say it so specifically in my comment, but you were more precise. I think that when I look back historically, many of these issues were swept under the rug, and there was denial in many quarters. So, on the specific, yes, I agree with your point. But secondly, no, we have a ways to go here. And his point relates to this last question in a way. I think that we are celebrating because it is very relevant. We have expanded the concept. But I think clearly by the questions and comments by all of you, there are very complex situations relevant to human dignity and that go to the heart of it. I think I said myself, I don't see us having 100% kind of solution. I don't know if we ever will. I think the reason why I am optimistic is because, at least here in the United States, I believe that we care. And we're going to debate these issues, and we're going to expose it and get it out there. Not other societies, many other societies don't do that. So in that sense, I am optimistic, and I think we must continue to lead in this area, and we must continue to have this kind of analysis and scrutiny as to what is the most optimal situation or circumstances for individuals.
So Tony, do you have some concluding remarks that maybe also address this problem of state sovereignty still being?
Let me first say I agree 100% with what Paula said, and I would agree exactly with what you said. Things like genocide, torture are unconscionable, and we need to continue to fight against them. We do have a long way to go. I do find optimism, but we have a long way to go. And to draw on Reinhold Niebuhr, we live in a sinful world. We will always live in a sinful world, and we need to remember that because even as we make progress, sin can pull us back in the other direction. I think it's extraordinarily important that we always bear that in mind. Now, your question, remind me your question. Okay, it's a good question. Sovereignty, to some degree, is a myth. And what I mean by that is this. States enter into agreements to do things at the international level. States join international organizations. Whenever they do that, they are using their sovereign right to say, I want this to be regulated by an international organization. I'm going to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I'm going to become a member of the United Nations. I'm going to become a member of a regional organization. Ultimately, in my view, it's not about in any way transgressing sovereignty, but rather working with states to convince states that regulating these problems in this particular way is the only way you're going to regulate it. Easy example, but World Health. We can't eradicate disease by individual states doing what they want. It has to happen through some kind of international collaboration because obviously disease transcends boundary. So what you want to do is convince states that this makes the best sense. This is the way to do it. And so states are voluntarily saying, yes, we want to do that. Now that requires a little bit of public relations. In some cases, it requires a very active NGO and civil society community which can lay out the issues and perhaps help states. And it requires a willingness to be able to enter into public-private partnerships where states can say, we can go so far, but then we need the collaboration of these entities. So that's how I see it. Not as violating sovereignty or as in any way conflicting with sovereignty, but allowing states as sovereigns to see these make the best sense.
you want to maybe take up this issue of the bases of, do we need to deepen our reflection and broaden consensus around what human dignity means? Is that an important?
I think we can't be afraid of exploring the foundations of our beliefs in human dignity. But to take the issue that you suggested, the death penalty, you know, for some Christians, that is clearly a religious commitment based on reverence for life, reverence for human beings as made in the image and likeness of God. But in its clarification of the withdrawal of, if you will, approval for the death penalty, the Catechism kind of said, well, you know, today, and the Pope has said, Pope John Paul II, that, you know, today's society can protect itself, so therefore we don't need the death penalty. So it took a back way out. And that's a way to acknowledge the sinfulness of the world, but also to allow itself to deal with the reality of sinfulness, and to acknowledge that there are other people out there who don't look at it the same way, that may want to reason about it. And the reasoning here is that you needed it for protection of the lives of the people who are in the state. I think with respect to the basic commitments, for Christians, I think there needs to be a heightened sense of what the source is, but that may not always be shareable. And just as, you know, Maritain and others found, I think in many cases we find, even as Benedict talks about Benedict talked recently in Caritas and Veritate about working on these problems, but with people of goodwill. He was saying we can have common cause about justice and peace. He didn't, even though he firmly believed that it was the transcendence of the human being, the self-transcendence of the human being that grounded human dignity. He didn't make the appeal that they had to have that same ground, that we could have a practical agreement. That was John's solution. I think Benedict, despite what we think about him and despite his own preferences, settles for that. And I think that's kind of where we are.
May I just make one last comment on, because I really wanted to, and the professor who referenced genocide, just in a personal note, I didn't say it, I'm of Ukrainian descent, and Ukrainians know very well what genocide is about in my own family, my own heritage. In fact, so much so, my own father, who was a professor here at Georgetown University, worked with Raphael Lemkin on the Genocide Convention, for those of you who may know the name. But why I reference it, I remember my father telling me that there were so many who were opposed to having a convention on genocide. And for me, I look at it in that context of when there was denial, not only denial of circumstances, but even denial to take action, you know, and actually formulate a convention, and to move forward and to really tackle it so it would never occur again. Forgive me, I just wanted to underscore the personal point. Sorry.
Got up in the Senate of the United States and gave a 1-minute speech every time the Senate was in business for a period of nearly 12 years before the United States Senate ever got around to ratifying the convention.
Yeah. Well, I think it is appropriate, after 5-6 hours of celebrating the legacy of Pacem and Terris, to recognize that there's a long way to go in reality, and realizing this vision of human dignity and peace in world affairs. We've covered a lot of ground in this panel. I'm very thankful to you all. Thank you all for coming. I want to especially thank my colleagues, Aaron Coleman from the Berkley Center, and especially Sam Wagner from the Office of the President, for helping to put together this event. John and I are grateful for their support and the support of other staff. We want to remind you that, as you've seen here, this event is being taped. There'll be a video available on the Office of the President website, so we encourage you to share, in a way, our discussion with friends and colleagues more widely. So thank you for coming, and please join me in thanking our panelists.